Don't eat it. Your wife put poison. The scream tore through the bright morning air like a blade. A maid wagered her future on a single breath that left her body like a flare in noon light. That breath shattered a ritual, stalled a fork above a white plate, and set an entire city whispering about the danger that can sit closest to a man's heart. The mansion in Lekki glittered as if nothing bad could cross its marble floors. Sunlight poured through tall curtains, struck crystal like small stars, and slid over a dining table polished to a mirror. The morning pretended to be ordinary. The morning lied. Daniel Okoye entered the room with the calm stride of a man whose life answered to a clock. A neon yellow polo marked him out against the soft creams of the room. He carried the quiet weight of responsibility the way other men carried jewelry. The schedule sat already in his mind. Breakfast at 8, a board call at 9, a site inspection by noon, a small act of charity nobody would ever know about before dusk. He lowered himself into the head chair and let his shoulders release a fraction. The plate set before him steamed with jollof and rich stew, the scent warm and familiar. A reminder that success could still taste like childhood. On the opposite side of the table, the maid in teal moved as carefully as a prayer. The house knew her steps. She did not intrude on moments. She sustained them. For 4 years she had mended seams, rescued white shirts from careless stains, learned the stubborn moods of indoor plants, and kept silence as a sacred craft. The staff called her loyal. The marble called her light-footed. The man at the head of the table called her part of the house. She had always accepted that definition because being part of something felt safer than being outside with nothing. This day would change the meaning of belonging forever. To Daniel's right, the woman in red placed a cloche upon a silver tray, as if laying down a crown. The dress fit like an announcement. The jewelry caught the sun with the confidence of wealth. Her face held the polished ease of someone accustomed to admiration and to obedience. Years of social choreography had taught her how to fold kindness around control. The mansion reflected her taste, and the city praised her for it. People said the couple made sense together. The measured builder and the elegant flame. The air held warmth from the kitchen, the citrus of fresh juice, the softness of linen warmed by light. A fork rose from the table, glinted, paused above the rice. In that inch of distance between utensil and meal the entire story balanced. The teal uniform broke the hush first. The maid's body moved before thought could negotiate. Her hand extended, her voice tore free, and the morning split into a before and an after that would never again touch. Sound stabbed the quiet. The plate remained, the cloche gleamed, the fork trembled, and 3 faces turned into masks of surprise, anger, and terror. The scream lived without words now. It lived as posture, as pointing finger, as wet sheen in eyes that had watched something no maid should be forced to watch. The man at the table felt the old instincts of leadership misfire. He had learned to solve problems by weighing information, aligning facts, and deciding. Nothing in that training prepared him for the screech of instinct over etiquette. He looked at the plate and saw safety by habit. He looked at the maid and saw history pressed into a single plea. He looked at the woman in red and saw the life he had promised to protect. A taste rose in his mouth that was not from food. It was the metallic ghost of fear. He steadied his hand, because steadiness had built his empire, and he searched for an anchor in the room. The woman in red supplied an alternative world faster than fear could arrange the truth. Her face tightened around practiced wounds. Her shoulders shook the way shoulders are meant to shake when someone is wronged. Her hand hovered near the man's shoulder in a gesture that looked like comfort and registered as possession. She moved the story toward a familiar shape where servants misbehaved and wives endured. She made a claim on the narrative, and the staff at the doorway learned from years of employment how to arrange their eyes to avoid the storm. The maid's chest heaved under the teal. Her throat burned with the force of the sound she had released. The rules of the house stacked against her in neat, invisible columns. Hierarchy, decorum, gratitude, fear. Yet beneath those rules another law had been written on her bones by a mother who stitched truth into her childhood one frayed day at a time. That law said that silence can become a weapon if evil asks for it. The law pushed her forward when every rule begged her to shrink. She held her ground even when the floor seemed to tilt under her feet, even when the weight of wealth rolled toward her like thunder. Memory rose in the man like heat. He remembered the maid's quiet miracles, remembered a lost cufflink restored to his desk before he missed it, remembered a plant in his office revived after he forgot it existed. He remembered a December morning when she had placed a sealed envelope under his door with the names of 3 drivers who could not afford school fees for their children, and he had sent money with no questions because the note came from someone who noticed. Those memories flickered against a newer image of the woman in red crying in a way that flattered cameras. Loyalty argued with love. Pride argued with common sense. Between the two arguments steamed a plate. The house held its breath. The gardener paused outside by the hibiscus hedge. A driver at the gate adjusted his cap and went still. The cook in the corridor closed both hands around a dish towel and squeezed. The mansion had learned over time to mute its workers into background, but in this minute the background pulsed with witness. A hierarchy could be enforced, a silence could be purchased, an outcome could still be changed. Security arrived with the institutional quiet of men used to entering rooms that require discretion. Their presence thickened the air. The woman in red found new angles for indignation. The maid stood inside the circle of consequences and discovered that sometimes courage feels like standing on the wrong side of a line drawn in polished stone. Her breath steadied. Her eyes moved toward the kitchen doorway as if a compass needle had caught a magnetic field. Proof lived not in throats, but in objects. She understood this with a clarity that did not ask permission. The man required proof because proof had guided every contract he ever signed. He searched the maid's face for evidence and found only sincerity shaped by fear. He searched the face of the woman in red and found the theater of injury. The difference between performance and pain is usually easy for men who build to see. It was not easy in that room where love and status conspired to blur edges. He lifted a hand trained to deliver verdicts and delayed one. He told himself that caution was wisdom. He told himself that calm was fairness. He told himself many things that were true in meetings and useless at a table where a life waited in sauce. The fork lowered a fraction. The plate breathed steam like a creature. The morning leaned toward a decision. The maid's gaze held to the kitchen door where a pantry hid a memory. In the hours before this room arranged itself into a courtroom, she had moved through that pantry with a cloth and a list, had interrupted a whisper, and had watched a small brown bottle pour something clear into sauce, as casually as a ring slipping from a finger. She had not meant to see it. She had only meant to finish her work before the city's heat turned the upper floors into an echo of the street outside. She had hidden behind stacked tins while a voice spoke of ownership, as if blood could be the price of a house. That was the moment the rules of her life fell apart and reassembled into a ladder she would climb even if it cut her hands. She had waited for the kitchen to empty, had looked at the bottle left on the counter with a label peeled to anonymity, had felt rage arrive like fever, and had felt fear arrive like ice poured down her back. She had lifted the bottle with a fingertip and watched the light claim it. She had placed it down again because consequences lurked in fingerprints. She had turned toward the dining room because seconds escaped like birds when a window is opened. Now, in the bright quiet of judgment, she stood at the edge of exile and held on to a single conviction. Leaving the room without changing it would be a form of murder. The woman in red had power. The maid had truth. Power and truth met in the space above a spoonful of stew and waited to see which one would flinch. The man gave the order that kept his morning from collapsing into chaos. The order moved bodies. The security men edged closer to the teal uniform. The staff lowered their eyes again because justice can be dangerous for people paid by the hour. The woman in red relaxed a muscle in her jaw and let triumph curl a corner of her mouth. The maid understood the meaning of the curl and stored it like evidence. She did not resist when hands directed her toward the staircase. She remembered another staircase, the narrow servants' steps hidden behind the pantry door, and she felt a plan assembling itself from fear and obligation. Outside the dining room, the mansion resumed its soundtrack. A generator hummed faintly as backup, though the power had not threatened to fail. Traffic beyond the gate spilled its steady song. Somewhere a phone vibrated against a glass table with a message that would become important later. The maid reached her small room and stared at the suitcase that had waited beside her bed like a prophecy she refused to accept. 30 minutes had been given to fold a life. 30 minutes is a long time for regret and a short time for rescue. She chose rescue. Courage does not always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like steps taken on the edges of sound. She opened her door, pressed a palm against cool wall, and slipped down the servant staircase while the mansion believed she was packing the pieces of a quiet life. The steps creaked in places she had memorized and avoided in other years. Today the wood talked, and she could not afford conversation. She reached the pantry and pressed her ear to the door. The voice she feared flowed through like oil, low and calm, not yet aware that plans leak. Words slid out that would later persuade men in uniforms to move faster than they liked. The maid held her breath until the voice moved away. Then she entered the kitchen and found the brown bottle waiting with the patience of a trap. She slid the bottle into a pocket of her apron and felt its shape brand her through the fabric. Her hands trembled, not because she doubted what she was doing, but because she understood the line she had crossed. Evidence makes enemies. She retraced her steps with knees that had learned to bend under burdens and returned to the little room where a suitcase still lay open like a mouth. The plan changed again. Police would listen to a wife in red and not to a maid in teal. She pulled a worn boot from under the bed, pushed the bottle into the toe, and considered who in Lagos would care about truth enough to test it without ceremony. A memory answered with a name and a hospital and a donation that had lit up a ward for children who could not afford light. She reached for her old phone and felt panic crawling up her throat like smoke. The line connected, and a voice responded that belonged to a woman who respected facts. The maid gave her name, her urgency, her little stash of courage, and her plan. The voice on the other end understood the cadence of emergencies and promised a quiet response. The maid hid the boot in the suitcase and closed the lid as footsteps approached down the corridor with the measured rhythm of men who enforce orders. Time folded around her like a net. She lifted the handle of the suitcase and felt the weight of proof ride above the wheels. At the bottom of the grand staircase, the man in the neon polo appeared again, adjusting a cuff as if something ordinary could still be salvaged from the morning. Their eyes found each other and both flinched at what they had become to one another in 60 minutes, a pair of strangers connected by the most intimate risk of all. He turned away because turning away is easier than looking at the person who might be right when being right is a threat to your life as you know it. The guards shepherded the maid toward the back entrance, and the house exhaled the relief of structures returning to familiar shapes. The gate outside argued briefly with the siren that rose beyond it. The siren won. Vehicles entered the compound with a polite urgency reserved for places where money expects discretion and emergencies still demand it. A woman in a white coat stepped into the bright morning with papers and a transparent sleeve and a face that would not smile until the work was finished. The dining room paused again, this time in a new kind of silence. The truth had asked for a witness. The witness had arrived. What happened next would explode beyond the walls into timelines and talk shows and lectures about class and kindness. Before any of that, the story belonged to the dawn. The first move had not been the scream. The first move had been the movement of a small bottle from a red purse to a saucepan while a house pretended to nap. To understand the heat gathering above the plate, the city would need to return to the kitchen where daylight had not yet colored the tiles and a heart had learned the shape of fear. The day had begun as all days begin, in the quiet spaces where people believe nobody is watching. The white coat had entered like a verdict wrapped in paper, yet the mansion tried to return to its regular pulse, the way the sea smooths itself after a stone is thrown. Doors sighed closed. Air conditioning filled the halls with polite chill. A chandelier settled above the dining room and pretended not to remember the scream that had lifted every crystal into a brief shiver. But the quiet now carried edges. Every step seemed to tap a thin glass wall. Upstairs, in the servants' quarters, The room that belonged to the maid looked like a truth placed inside a jewel box. The ceilings were lower. The window is smaller. The light gentler. A shelf of folded uniforms lined one wall, teal stacked on teal like narrow calm. The bed was a narrow plank softened by careful sheets. By the pillow lay a string of old wooden beads rubbed smooth by someone else's sorrow years ago. A photograph leaned against the lamp, her mother's face, tired and bright at once, a headscarf tied with stubborn pride. The frame was chipped on one corner where it had once fallen and been rescued. Maya stood inside that small square of ownership and breathed as if air might refuse to enter her. The echo of the siren still lived under her skin. The weight of the bottle in the boot pressed against her memory with the insistence of a heartbeat. She sat on the bed and let the room gather her. The service bell in the corridor clicked once like a metronome measuring duties. She ignored it for the first time in years. Her hands found the wooden beads and threaded them through her fingers, not to count prayers, but to count courage. Her mother's voice returns the way the scent of palm oil returns when a kitchen remembers last night's stew, steady, practical, unafraid of hard truths. Courage, her mother had taught, is not loud. It is precise. It knows where to stand and when to move. The first time courage had been required of her arrived long before marble floors reflected her footsteps. It came on a rainy afternoon in Ajagunal where a landlord had wanted the rent before her mother's shift ended. Maya had been 13. She had stood in a doorway with rain in her hair and explained in a voice that shook but did not break that money would come on Friday because her mother always kept her word. The landlord had left with a mutter. Friday had come. The world had not ended. A small lesson had carved itself into her marrow. Sometimes you hold a door with nothing but posture until help arrives. Help in this house had not always worn white coats. Sometimes it had looked like a signature at the bottom of an unseen check. Sometimes it had taken the shape of the man at the head of the table calling a contractor and insisting that a worker injured on site be treated at the company's cost. She remembered that day because she had carried the man's coat to his car and overheard the insistence that turned into relief on another family's face miles away. She had understood then why she respected him. Not because he was rich. Because power in his hands had often behaved like responsibility. Her first week in the mansion had been the quiet beginning of a devotion. She had learned the geography fast. The pantry that stayed cool even in dry season, the corner of the upstairs corridor that gathered dust the way some places gather gossip, the garden where hibiscus drank heat and returned it as red. The staff had shown her the invisible routes that servants used to avoid colliding with wealth. The back stairs, the side gate. The rhythm of footsteps that arrive and depart like tides. The woman in red had offered a smile that felt like a photograph, beautiful, flat, impossible to lean against. The man had offered a nod that felt like an oath. In the small space between those two offerings, Maya had built her understanding of the house. The understanding had begun to crack not with the sight of a bottle but with whispers that acted like drafts sneaking under a closed door. Deliveries at hours that did not suit dinner. Packages that disappeared into wardrobes without receipts. Phone calls that thickened the air with secrecy. Chioma had been a study in grace for guests. She had turned into efficient weather behind closed doors. Sudden gusts, sharp temperatures, a pressure drop that left everyone braced. The mirror in her dressing room had witnessed performances and revisions. It had also recorded the late-night calls where she spoke without the charm that lacquered her presence in public. The maid who learned to hear the tenor of a house could tell when tenderness was theater. On this morning, that tenor had become a siren. The image of the cloche shining like a helmet would not leave Maya's head. Under that curve had lived a plan. Under that plan had lived greed. The word itself tasted metallic. Greed, for Chioma, had not sounded like hunger. It had sounded like arithmetic done in whispers, the knowledge of debts that smelled of foreign trips and risky hands around cards, the scratch of pens signing loans that expected men to keep dying or keep paying. The shape of another shadow sometimes passed through the house too, a cologne that did not belong to her husband's wardrobe, a car that idled near the side gate under the dark stain of a flamboyant tree. An affair did not need to be confirmed when the air confirmed it twice a week. Maya let the beads rest and opened the wardrobe where her few private things crowded together politely. A sweater for rainy nights, a slip of a dress she wore on free Sundays to church, a shoebox holding bus tickets and hospital receipts from years her mother survived by will. She touched the edges of each artifact, as if blessing them for witness. The house wanted to push her out with the force of offended hierarchy. But her life did not end at the back gate. Her life had acquired a duty. She felt it walk into the room and sit on the bed like a quiet guest who had no intention of leaving. The decision to act scalded and cooled her. Fear of poverty rose like a tide. Guilt about inaction rose like a second tide that refused to let the first swallow the shore. Between those waters a narrow bar of sand appeared where a person could stand and choose. She pictured the man in the neon polo, the way shock had armored his face, the way pride had argued with sense. She pictured the woman in red, hands glossy with lotion and plans. She pictured the plate she had interrupted, the invisible edge on which his next breath had been waiting. The choice returned with the steadiness of the beads in her hand. Silence was complicity. Action was hazard. Only one of these she could live with when night turned rooms into courts and pillows into witnesses. Elsewhere in the mansion, a larger room performed calm. The study smelled of leather and ink and the faint charge of electronics. Shelves rose behind a desk where awards sat with quiet vanity. The man who owned those shelves paced the rug in careful lines as if rewriting a map he had always trusted. The screen kept returning to the exact second where it had cut the day. He told himself that stress made people theatrical. He told himself the maid was loyal but naive. He told himself his wife had a temper but loved fiercely. Words arranged themselves like soldiers on a parade ground. Behind them, doubt moved like a scout along the wall. He poured water he did not drink. He checked a calendar he did not read. He smoothed a collar that did not need smoothing. He remembered a time in university when a friend had warned him about a partner he admired, and he had chosen loyalty over truth. Business had taught him the invoice for that error later. Now, the invoice in this house came with a different currency. His mind touched the plate again and flinched. He had seen men die suddenly. He had attended funerals where grief moved like choreography. He had never imagined being a man whose death would be planned in his own kitchen. The door whispered. The woman in red entered as if grief itself had dressed in color and decided to be generous. Her eyes carried water, like a prophecy designed for anyone who needed consolation. She took his hands with the authority of ritual and pressed patience into his palms. She reminded him of his generosity. She reminded him of the trouble staff invent when kindness spoils them. She let shame grow in the space between them until he mistook the feeling for responsibility. Pride, wounded by the idea that his household could be out of order, reached for blame that kept his image intact. The woman understood how to feed that pride crumbs until it behaved like loyalty. He walked her to the window. Cars moved below like metal fish. The hibiscus hedge held its red as if color itself had chosen stubbornness. He told himself the hospital vehicle at the gate was a misunderstanding that would be resolved with apologies and maybe donations. He told himself to be calm because calm had kept him alive in spaces where panic would have invited ruin. In the glass, two reflections stood side by side, neon and red. He did not notice how one smile sharpened when the other turned away. Back in the servants' quarters, Maya lifted her suitcase to the bed. The zipper teeth looked like a line of soldiers too small to ward off trouble and too loyal to step aside. She unrolled the dresses. She pressed the sweater to her face and smelled a rainy city. She tucked the photograph into the inside pocket because memory needed protection from weather and from moves. She added a small book where she had written the names of people to call if life fractured. A cousin in Surulere with a bed made of promises. A church friend who worked night shifts and believed in the power of soup. The number to the hospital whose director had once shaken her employer's hand and thanked him for bringing light where suffering had learned to live. Beneath the clothes, the worn boot waited, heavy with a secret that could break a neck of lies. Her hands trembled not with indecision now, but with the electricity that runs through a body when it has agreed to pay a price. Every fold of cloth sounded like thunder. Every step toward the suitcase felt like walking into rain that had been delayed for months. She feared the open street that might be her next address. She feared a closed coffin that might be her employer's if she obeyed the house. She feared hunger. She feared headlines. She feared silence more than any of these. On the other side of the thick door, Chioma stood in the dressing room where mirrors multiplied a person until truth became an option among many images. She adjusted a necklace, examined a face for softness under pressure, and spoke into a phone lowered to her shoulder to cushion the sound. The voice on the other end moved with the familiarity of family or of collusion. The words braided greed with logistics. The world of accounts and deadlines hummed like an engine behind the velvet of her sentences. A debt waited in the dark like a mouth. An affair smiled from a balcony out of town. An inheritance glittered in her imagining, already spent in rooms she had not yet entered. She told herself that survival, at her level, required decisiveness that tender people misnamed cruelty. She placed it of perfume at the throat, where pulse confessed itself. She practiced sadness in the mirror, held it, released it, perfected it. Maya shut the suitcase halfway and sat again, because standing threatened to fold her. The beads returned to her hand. The room pressed close as if listening. She examined the map of her life since walking through the servants' gate for the first time, the long mornings of folded laundry like clouds, the quiet evenings when she stayed after hours to polish silver because excellence felt like a prayer. The days she signed for deliveries and watched the handwriting of strangers declare what luxury looked like up close. The admiration she felt for the man had been stainless. It was not romance. It was a truthful response to decency, the way people in a city learn to point out the few good policemen and carry their names as talismans. To let a man like that die because she preferred safety would be to spoil the part of herself that still believed the world could be improved by ordinary people doing the exact hard thing available to them. In the study, the man finally sat. He allowed the chair to catch him and admitted a fatigue that had not touched him in years. He closed his eyes and saw the maid's hand extended, the finger pointing like a compass needle refusing to accept the wrong north. He opened his eyes and saw financial forecasts, project charts, photos of ribbon cuttings where he stood between grateful men and carried oversized scissors with awkward dignity. He had been many things to this city: builder, employer, donor. He had rarely been a man who needed saving. Pride recoiled and then, almost shyly, stepped aside. Doubt remained. Doubt asked to be fed. He did not know where to find the right meal. The house's second story, the story that floats above chandeliers and below bank balances, began to arrange itself. It had always been there, a web of glances and guesses, small sacrifices and larger secrets. The first story of any mansion speaks in invoices and invitations. The second story speaks in whispers and in the echo of shoes that take stairs two at a time when emergencies choose a route. Maya rose. Her body remembered the map. She slid the zipper to the end and closed the suitcase without locking it. The unlocked case felt like an admission that she belonged neither to safety nor to exile yet. Her eyes moved to the door, as if the wood could advise her. No counsel arrived, only the hum of a hallway that had watched other servants leave at night with their futures tied up in plastic bags. She stood, pressed her palm to the photograph in her pocket, and turned her face toward the corridor. The corridor received her with its smell of polish and starch. A small square of sun had climbed the wall and now sat precisely where it sat every day at this hour, oblivious to human drama. She could walk left to the back stairs and leave the house properly, cleanly, empty-handed except for luggage. Or she could walk right to the narrow door behind the pantry and enter the path that servants took when they needed to avoid being seen. One route offered compliance. The other offered consequence. She took one step, then another. Her hands trembled, not because she was uncertain, but because the body sometimes shakes when the soul takes a vote and wins. At the end of the corridor, the servants' staircase waited like a thin throat through which a whole story might pass. The wood remembered her weight. The shadows welcomed familiar feet. She paused on the threshold to listen. Down below, a voice murmured in the dressing room. Sugar over steel. Farther off, the study chair creaked as a man shifted a future in his mind. Closer still, her suitcase wheels whispered against the floor like small animals trying to be brave. The decision hardened inside her the way palm oil thickens when the pot cools and then holds its shape when heat returns. She angled the suitcase toward the right. The narrow door received her. The staircase curled down into a seam of the mansion that never made it into photographs. Every mansion, she understood, carries two stories at once, the one built of stone and the one built of silence. She stepped into the second and began to descend. The mansion had never been this quiet at midday. Usually, there was motion, the thud of cleaning buckets, the distant laughter of guards by the gate, the hum of a blender in the kitchen, the rhythm of a home alive with servants trained to move without sound yet never still. But now, silence had occupied every hallway like an invisible visitor. Even the clocks seemed to measure fear. Each tick sounded deliberate, like footsteps sneaking closer to discovery. Maya stood halfway down the servant staircase, the railing cold beneath her palm, breath shallow and uneven. The air was thick, too still, too expectant. Below her, the ground floor opened into the gleaming corridors of the mansion, sunlight dripping through glass like liquid gold across the tiles. She listened. No movement, no voice. Only the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen, steady as a heartbeat. Her own heartbeat answered faster. Each step she took was a trespass against safety, against everything servants are taught. Obey, retreat, vanish. Yet something greater than fear pushed her down the stairs, the image of Daniel's plate, the steam that had risen like an omen, the thought that a man so kind could be murdered by love served warmly. She could not let that happen. The servants' staircase ended at the back hallway near the pantry. The door stood slightly ajar. Light leaked out in a sharp, sterile slice. She pressed herself to the wall and peeked through the gap. The kitchen gleamed, chrome, marble, spotless. The sink sparkled with recent use. A pot still sat on the stove, lid tilted. And on the counter, exactly where her memory said it would be, lay the small brown bottle. It looked so harmless now. Ordinary. Lifeless. Her fingers twitched. Every part of her wanted to rush in, grab it, and run. But instinct made her wait. Something in the silence felt wrong. Rehearsed, almost deliberate. Then she heard it, a voice. Chioma's voice. Low, calm, perfectly composed. The voice of a woman used to orchestrating lies. Maya froze, her back pressed to the cool wall, her heart hammering loud enough to betray her. Yes, mother, Chioma said softly, her tone coated in ice.
He didn't eat it.
The stupid maid screamed before he could take a bite. But don't worry, I'll handle dinner myself. By midnight, it will look like a heart attack.
No mess.
No questions. Maya's knees weakened. The world tilted. For a second she thought she would faint. Her vision blurred with hot tears she dared not release. She covered her mouth with both hands to keep the cry from escaping. Chioma continued, her heels clicking lightly as she paced. Yes, I know what's at stake. You think I'll let your debt ruin me? Never. He'll be gone before sunrise, and every property will revert in my name. No one will ever suspect. The maid? I'll have her arrested for theft before the night ends. There was a pause, the faint sound of a match lighting a scented candle, the exhale of smoke, a sigh of pleasure at her own control.
Then, yes.
I'll call you when it's done. Maya stood still until she heard the rustle of a silk dress fade through the corridor. The click of Chioma's heels grew smaller. A door closed. Silence again, deeper now, more dangerous. Maya exhaled shakily, her palms wet. Her mind screamed, go back. Forget this.
Run.
But another voice, softer, older, her mother's, whispered, child, truth will not protect itself. You must. She opened the pantry door and slipped inside the kitchen. The air was warm with the smell of stew and perfume. Every sound she made felt magnified. The brush of her skirt, the shift of her breath, the soft squeak of her shoe against tile. She reached the counter and stared at the bottle. It was smaller than she remembered. Dark glass. The label half peeled, leaving a blank scar across the surface.
No marquines. No scent.
But evil didn't always smell. Sometimes it hid behind beauty. Sometimes it sat beside the salt. She picked it up with trembling fingers. For a moment, she saw her reflection in the steel surface of the refrigerator, eyes wide, mouth set in disbelief. A maid holding proof of murder in a house that would call her a liar. Who will believe me? She thought. Who will listen to a maid against a wife dressed in diamonds? Her throat tightened. Doubt scratched at her resolve. But beneath it pulsed something stronger. The memory of Daniel's kindness, the envelope he once left for her when her mother was sick, the way he said, "Family is everything." Family. And now, the very word was being poisoned on his plate. Maya clenched the bottle and slid it deep into her apron pocket. The glass pressed against her hip, cold and heavy. A truth she could not drop. Then came the sound that froze her blood. Footsteps. Chioma's returning. Maya's breath caught. There was no time to hide properly. She darted into the pantry, crouching behind a stack of rice sacks. Through the slats of the door, she saw Chioma glide back into the kitchen, phone in hand, humming faintly. Her face glowed with satisfaction. She poured herself a glass of juice, leaned on the counter, and began rehearsing her performance. "I just don't understand it," she murmured, voice dripping with practiced sorrow. How could the maid say such a thing? Poor Daniel. He's been under stress lately, maybe that's why his heart gave out. "I tried everything." She stopped, frowned, changed the tone. "No, officer, she was always a troubled girl. I gave her work out of pity. You can ask anyone. I treated her like family." A small laugh escaped her lips, a sound without joy. "Perfect," she whispered. "Tragic but graceful. Lagos will believe every word." Maya's nails dug into her palms until she felt pain. Every syllable struck her like a whip. This wasn't just deceit. It was art, polished and rehearsed, a lie designed to survive truth. Chioma picked up the cloche from breakfast, wiped it with a napkin, and placed it neatly on the table again, her movements almost tender. She was setting the scene for her alibi, sculpting pity like marble. When she finally left, her perfume lingered behind like a threat. Maya waited a full minute before moving. Then another. The clock on the wall ticked twice, a sound of permission. She emerged from the pantry, lightheaded and trembling, clutching the pocket where the bottle hid. Every corner of the house now felt like an enemy. The stairs seemed longer, the walls closer, the air thinner. She moved quickly, hugging shadows, avoiding the bright slats of sunlight that fell across the floor. One misstep, one sound, and Chioma would know. At the landing, she paused and looked back, at the table gleaming under the chandelier, the untouched glass of juice, the cloche polished to a mirror. Everything looked perfect. Everything was wrong. She turned and climbed the servant stairs again, each step a drumbeat against the quiet. Upstairs, in her small room, she locked the door and collapsed on the bed. Her breath came in ragged bursts. She pulled the bottle from her apron and placed it on the table under the lamp. Light refracted through the glass, throwing a faint shadow across her wall, the shadow of death. She stared at it. This was her proof. Her curse. Her only weapon. Tears blurred her vision. "I'm just the maid," she whispered. "Nobody will believe me. Not the guards, not the police. They'll say I'm angry or jealous or lying for money." She pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes until stars danced behind them. She could almost hear Chioma's voice again, that icy calm. "By midnight, it will look like a heart attack."
No.
She couldn't let that happen. Her thoughts searched desperately for an ally, someone outside this house of masks. Someone who owed nothing to Chioma. And then, like a light flicking on in a dark corridor, she remembered. Dr. Ife. A name, a face, a debt of kindness. The Dr. Daniel had once helped when her hospital needed funding. Maya had seen the thank you letter framed in the corridor months ago. The woman had written, "Your generosity saved more lives than you know." If anyone could help her now, it was that woman. Maya wiped her face with a corner of her sleeve, sat up straight, and reached for her old phone on the shelf. The battery was low, the casing cracked, but it still worked. Her fingers shook as she unlocked it. She hesitated, one breath, two, then dialed the hospital's general line. The ring tones stretched into eternity. When the receptionist answered, Maya's voice barely came out. "Please," she whispered, "I need to speak to Dr. Ife. It's urgent. Tell her it's about Mr. Okoye. His life is in danger." There was confusion on the other end, the faint rustle of papers, the sound of transfer tones. Then a woman's voice, calm, mature, professional. "This is Dr. E speaking. Who is this?" Maya swallowed hard. "My name is Maya. I work in Mr. Okoye's house." "Please, Ma, you don't know me, but I have proof. His wife, she tried to poison him."
I saw it.
"I have the bottle." A stunned silence. Then a measured reply. "Are you certain of what you're saying?" Maya's breath hitched. "Yes, Ma. She's planning again tonight. Please. I don't know who else to call." The line stayed quiet for a heartbeat. Then the doctor's voice softened. "Where are you now?" "In my room, Ma. The mansion in Lekki." "All right. Listen carefully. Do not confront anyone. Keep the bottle safe. I'll send an ambulance under a false call for routine checkup. Nothing suspicious. Hide the bottle until my team arrives. Do you understand?" Maya nodded, even though the doctor couldn't see her. "Yes, Ma. Please hurry." Her voice broke on the last word. When she hung up, the silence returned, heavier than before. But inside that silence, something new had awakened. Not just fear, but resolve. The kind that grows in small people when no one else stands between truth and destruction. She tucked the bottle into her boot, hid the phone under her pillow, and sat very still, watching the sliver of daylight crawl across her floor like a slow promise. Outside, the city roared faintly. Distant traffic, faraway sirens, the indifferent noise of Lagos continuing its noon. Inside, a maid waited in a room too small for what she carried. The proof of a crime, the weight of a conscience, and the single thread of hope that someone out there would believe her. Her heart pounded not from fear anymore, but from courage waking up in full. And as the clock ticked once more, Maya whispered to herself, "Steady now. Madam, please. I have proof."